The US delegation just met with Vladimir Putin and his staff in Moscow, and although there is no peace agreement yet, we seem to be one step closer to some form of a compromise, as the Russian TASS news agency puts it. Here to help explaining the developments are Ray McGovern and Larry Johnson. Larry, welcome.
Thanks, Pascal.
Thank you. Let's maybe begin with what do you think of this 5-hour marathon meeting that apparently the US and Russian side had in Moscow? Also, like the participants, how do you interpret it that this was mainly led by Mr. Witkoff and Jared Kushner on the US side? Maybe let's start with Ray.
Well, it's very interesting that Marco Rubio is not there. He's been shunted aside. And so have the Europeans, who have been very much opposed to this kind of rapprochement, or at least U.S.-Russian dealing on this very key issue of Ukraine. Who else is there? Well, I talk about Witkoff and son. It's not his son, of course. It's the son of, what's his name? Trump, right? His son-in-law, all right? So Witkoff, who is the son-in-law? Well, he's a real estate, he's a real kind of a financial guy, and he hits it off really well with Dmitriev, who is the Russians' financial guy. And they talked a little bit about the vast expansion of economic relations that can happen. Now, that may happen, but it's not going to happen for several years. But it's there, and they know that Trump is interested in that. Those who expected a settlement or really substantive talks have been disappointed because, as both sides agreed, these talking points going in, these points for discussion, were far from what could be agreed upon. What was agreed upon is to talk about these things at a later date. The most important thing is that territorial issues were addressed. Now, that surprised me. That's one of the details, but as Rubio himself has said, that's the real fly in the ointment, territorial issues. Of course they are. So what else? Well, I just broaden it out before I finish here. You know, I like to talk about the backdrop to all this. And the backdrop to all this is that we have a delusionary, narcissist as president. Now, if I'm giving President Putin the president's daily brief, and he asks me, what about Trump? What do you think he's going to do? I would have to say, beats the hell out of me in Russian. And it's really, he's so mercurial, we can't figure out what he's going to do one day to the next. So, Putin, what does that mean? That means, Mr. Putin, that he's got his fingers on those codes, okay? You got to treat a delusional narcissist like Trump. You would treat anyone of that kind. You have to be really gentle. You have to not provoke them. You have to play along. You have to flatter them. You have to say, "Oh, that was a great thing you did." And well, and you should have got a Nobel Peace Prize. So you play along, because the other extreme is you get him rattled, and God knows we can't really depend on anything that he's going to do. Okay, he's got the nuclear codes. Besides all that, the Russians have made it very clear since Trump took over that Trump is not Biden. Okay, they're talking to Trump. There's some evidence that Trump really is interested in a final deal on Ukraine. I believe he really is. So 3 more years of this guy. How are we going to deal with them? Very sort of like like porcupines mate in the jungle. You know how they mate very, very carefully. Okay, that's how Trump needs to be handled. And I think that since the Russians are winning in Ukraine and Putin's in no rush, what really needs explaining why is Trump so much in a rush? And we could talk about that later. I have a couple of theories on that, one of which is a little bit out of the ordinary. I'll stop here. I hope that helps.
Yeah, so Larry, how do you interpret this? I mean, it seems to me that we are like kind of circling in to
Yeah.
something workable, isn't it?
I'll quote Churchill when he said, "This is not the beginning of the end. This is, the end of the beginning," and something to that effect. There were a lot of, I think, I agree with what Ray was saying, that the Russians harbor no illusions about Trump and his stability. I don't think he's viewed as a reliable negotiating partner. I think the term mercurial is more apt. I think really the purpose of this meeting was, as the Russians have said, and Ushakov reiterated, they hadn't really, they had heard about all these different proposals, but they'd never had anything officially submitted to them. So, they wanted to get it officially submitted. I think part of the reason that Kushner went along as well was that Trump trusts Witkoff as a friend, but Kushner's family. And so he was going to get another read from a family member about what was going on. And Putin, as Putin does, is very meticulous, very lawyerly, and will explain in detail what the Russian position is, how the Russian position has evolved. I would imagine that there may have even been a minor history lesson presented by Putin. He loves to do the history thing. And so this was, this wasn't starting to negotiate over, how many troops could Ukraine have? Does is Russia really interested in getting back into the G7, going to the G8? I mean, it was, if you listen to Putin's press conference in last week out in was it in Kazakhstan, or when he was asked about the G7, he basically said, "You got to be kidding me! No, we're not going to do that. That's why join a losers club," was basically his message. But I think Ray is correct that in the back of the mind of the Russians, they want to avoid this escalating into a nuclear conflict, and so they've now gone back. Trump did a couple of things prior to this meeting. He suspended, I was told, all military aid to Ukraine. So it really cut it off. Stuff that was in the pipeline, he didn't send it anymore. So they're right now sort of, I think, laying the foundation for the actual negotiations. Because as Putin said also last week in Bishkek, that he said when they negotiate, Lavrov is going to be in the lead, and Ushakov will be there as well. And the Russians, as Ray knows, they weigh heavily on protocol, so they're not going to have Lavrov sit down with some number 2, number 3 flunky. It should be Rubio should be there. Now, will Rubio try to sabotage the process? Because I think Ray's correct in raising. I'm not sure Trump's got a lot of confidence in him. But he's also sitting in, he's doing what no other person's done since Henry Kissinger worn the 2 hats of Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. So, this process, everybody's hoping that they can come to a deal and sign it by Christmas. Hey, don't hold your breath. This could be anywhere from a 6-month to a year process. And in the meantime, the Russian offensive is picking up steam and may make the negotiations actually no longer relevant.
And how this is unfolding is quite surprising to me, because usually if you do diplomatic negotiations, ambassadors are involved, the foreign ministers are pivotal, right? And you try to create a structured process, first, second, third round, whatnot, and working groups and levels and so on. And here, this is like it's a business approach, right? It's my business clan, and somehow the Americans seem to have convinced the Russians to go along with this and send their business people, because a lot of it was also done through business. What is his name?
Kirill Dmitriev.
Dmitriev. It's quite I wonder what they are making out of it. I mean, especially the Russian side, because in a sense, what you want is the guarantees that whatever you negotiate will then be implemented, right? So you need institutional buy-in. Ray, what do you think? How are the Russians trying, or what is the Russian strategy in this situation? How to get the buy-in, let's say, from the security environment, the intelligence agencies like the CIA. We know the CIA is on the ground in Ukraine, right? So how would the Russians deal with the institutional side of whatever is being discussed there?
Well, with respect to the process, I would hate to be CEO of this company.
Which one?
Of the U.S. company here. It's not even consistent with the business practices. And the British have their way of saying this is not proper. It's not proper. It's improper, as a matter of fact. Well, of course he is. But it's Trump. It's mercurial. But that doesn't matter. The Russians, would they prefer a more orderly, straightforward approach? Of course they would, and they've said they would. But they deal with Trump the way he is, and they see some flexibility in Trump. And, it seemed to be mid-October when people like Kellogg and other hawks were telling Trump, look, Ukraine can still win this thing. And the Russians are falling apart. Their economy is just, they're losing, and they're losing 3 million troops every week. Yeah, it wasn't quite that bad, but then all of a sudden he found out that they were lying to him. Mid-October, okay? And that's when this whole thing started. That's when he called Putin and said, well, let's meet in Budapest. And then the next day he met Zelensky and told Zelensky, forget about those tomahawks. We're not going to give you those tomahawks for X, Y, and Z reasons. No. Well, those were 2 days in a row. And after that, Trump ran into a lot of flack, right? So it took him about a week to recover. And then you have Rubio and Lavrov talking, but that doesn't matter. And they're canceled the Budapest summit. But then all of a sudden somebody says, now, Donald, how about putting in really bad sanctions against Lukoil, against Rosneft? That'll do it. So now, their communications sub rosa, right? My notion is that somebody level-headed, perhaps even Trump himself, communicated to the Russians, look, I got to do this. It's not going to hurt you very much. The sanctions, even, what's his name? Even the Besant, the Treasury Secretary, says that they don't matter anymore. We're going to do this, but on the next day, Vladimir Putin, I'm going to send Dmitriev to Miami to talk with Witkoff and Jared Kushner. And maybe if Umerov from the Ukraine wants to, so we'll work that all out. Now, what happens? We have a really interesting intercepted conversation between Dmitriev and Ushakov, two very senior Russian leaders. My God, who leaked that? That's a major crime, whoever leaked that. Who collected it? Well, the usual suspects are the National Security Agency, or GCHQ in Britain. But, Dmitriev was in Saudi Arabia. It could be simple as a phone tap. The Saudis might. But whatever it was meant to show up how this thing initiated, okay? And what did it show? It showed that Dmitriev and Ushakov had prepared a little paper for Witkoff and the son, Jared Kushner, to review and have comments on. And was that a Russian initiative? No, that intercept suggests to me that Witkoff said, look, we need some kind of talking points to start out with, for God's sake. And we can't ask Rubio to do that. My God, it would be awful. So could you guys just give us a little paper? We'll get started and we'll add our own things. And if Umarov has something to say, that's how it started. It's clear in this intercept, okay? The intercept, the revelation of the intercept to, I guess it was the Observer, or no, it was some
Financial
other.
Times?
Was that?
I thought it was the Financial Times or the
No,
Economist.
it was the other one, Bloomberg. So they printed it in full in both languages. I could check it out. The English translation was good. So they wanted to scuttle the whole thing, but it was unabashed. We went ahead anyway. So I think then it was clear that we were ready to deal. The Russians are saying, look, remember when we were in Alaska together? Two things. You agreed to not insist on an immediate ceasefire and to prevent Zelensky and those Europeans from putting the kibosh on from sabotaging the whole thing. Now, you haven't done that. Well, you going to do that or not? And that's when, when, in my view, Trump realized he had been had by the likes of Kellogg and Rubio. I told Rubio at the end just last week, look, Marco, we have enough travel funds here for you to go round trip first class to Miami, but we don't have enough money to send you to Moscow for the negotiations where Steve is going and Jared. And by the way, we don't have enough money to send you to Brussels either. And that's a little embarrassed me because the NATO met today, the NATO ministerial, and this is the first time in history, or at least since 1958, when I started watching all this stuff, that the Secretary of State didn't show up at the NATO ministerial. So NATO's been dissed. The Europeans have been dissed. Zelensky, the last thing I'll say is, this is really cute. At the end of Ushakov's remarks, he's asked, where did Witkoff go? And Ushakov said, well, my understanding is that he went back to the U.S. Embassy. Yeah, but when is he going then? Is he going home? I think. But isn't he going to stop in Kiev? It's a question from the journalist. And Ushakov says, no, the U.S. delegation promised not to stop in Kiev. They're going straight home. Then there was this titter last night. Larry and I were discussing this. Would he stop in Ireland to not only have a Guinness, but to meet with Zelensky? What the hell is he doing in Ireland? Hey, he's there. There was rumors that, he's got to meet with Zelensky now. No deal. Went straight back home, as far as I know, to report to Trump. Now, it'd be interesting to see what the White House says. I haven't really seen anything really official from the White House yet. They're biding their time. I'm sure they'll take their cue from Trump, and we're likely to hear on Truth Social tomorrow how he feels about it.
Larry, how do you see this?
Yeah, no, it's all of this is, let's call it Kabuki theater to try to get ready for actual real negotiations. And there's, a lot of it is a dance until the foreign ministry gets involved. If we see that, if the foreign ministry gets involved, we'll know that, okay, they are actually serious about negotiating. They're setting up teams. They're doing everything that you described you should normally see. But we're not there yet. And part of, I called this, to quote Yogi Berra. Yogi Berra was a famous baseball player, played for the New York Yankees, and he was famous for his way of expressing things. Like he said, this is deja vu all over again. So part of what we're seeing here is a replay on a much larger scale of what happened with the Battle of Debaltseve in January of 2015. Because the Ukrainians were doing so poorly against the militias of Donetsk and Luhansk that they were encircled. They were facing defeat. And boy, Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, then president of France, they got very motivated. Merkel went to Moscow, convinced Putin to sign on to Minsk II, and they saved the Ukrainians. And as Merkel admitted in December of 2022, and it was backed up, and Holland said, yeah, that's right, she's right. That was entirely a ploy. Minsk 2 was just it was a ploy to get the fighting stopped so they could get help the Ukrainians recover, rearm, refit, recruit, be reborn. It was all a ploy so they could continue the war. And I think that's in part of what was going on here, because since September, in the last now 3 months, September through November, Russia has taken 86 different settlements, towns, villages, from north to south. And they have, Russia now has the manpower on the ground forces, that it can capture and control territory, something it didn't have a year ago. And the West is panicked. They're utterly panicked, particularly in Europe, because what are they going to do? If you remember the suggestion from the Europeans to say, okay, this 28-point peace plan for Trump. We think that this one point, I can't remember, was it number 16, that Ukraine should have an army of 800,000. Well, I did a little bit of addition. I could still do that kind of math, and discovered that the combined armies of Germany, France, and the UK total up less than 500,000. And they've got a lot more, the combined populations of those countries is probably well over 120 million. And here they're asking Ukraine, who's got a population now of 19 million, to pony up 800,000 soldiers. They're crazy. I mean, this shows how desperate they are.
And let's not forget, when Germany was reunited in the 2+4 framework, the Germans were allowed to maintain 370,000 or 380,000 combined troops, right? Not 800,000. So what would make anyone think that the Russians would agree to 800,000 on their doorstep? But that one aside, it seems to me that the Russians have like a very, very clear strategy, right? They will plow on the battlefield. They said so, slowly but meticulously, and they won the war of attrition, right? So by now it's not a question whether the attrition works. It's just like how much attrition there still will be, and how far they want to go. At the same time, they want to stop somewhere, right? Somewhere you need to have a line, and then you need to have some form of agreement. So on the diplomatic track, they are going along with the way that the Trump administration wants to implement this, probably in order to, as Ray is saying, to please Trump and at least not lose that line, right? So do you think that there is a strategy behind somehow then getting to this place where you can implement the grand scheme that the Russians want, which is a security arrangement in Europe? That's the difficult one to do, right? A umbrella agreement. I mean, stopping on Ukraine is one thing and dividing the land, but getting to the process, to the security agreement, is another one. Maybe we start with Larry and then Ray. How do you think they are trying to negotiate that larger framework that the Russians keep talking about for 3.5 years?
Well, I would suggest that the Europeans and the United States are going through a divorce, or at least a trial separation. And Ray was correct. For the first time ever, not even since he started working the issue, for the first time ever, Secretary of State didn't show up at the meeting, at the ministerial. And then if the reports are true that Trump has cut off the flow of aid to Ukraine, then you get the story of the corruption. The corruption story has gotten legs, and the corruption issue is far, far larger than just the 100 million that's been reported. It's in the billions, close to $50 billion out of 360 billion. Yeah, with a B.
But the corruption issue is pushed by the Americans. The Americans control NABU. So this is the U.S. side that says, let's cut them off.
Yeah, this is we're starting to give the Ukrainians a little push over the cliff. Say, hey, come up here and look at this, and then you give them a little shove, and off they fall. I think the realization for Trump's reading polls, and there is not widespread support like there was 4 years ago for supporting Ukraine. In fact, the corruption story, I believe, in part is being put out there deliberately in order to help further muddy the waters, because one of the things that is not really widely known publicly, well, not known, there are at least 23 members of Congress that have received millions of dollars. I know a particular Republican senator that got 16 to 17 million. A particular Democrat senator got 23 million. So this is money that we gave to Zelensky. We went to the Ukrainians. It then got diverted into banks up in the Baltics. And gee, I think we'll be shocked to discover that one foreign minister with the EU named Kaja Kallas may have had some actual financial incentives to be such an ardent supporter of Ukraine. You'll find that, but this money was going out to lubricate a variety of politicians on both the U.S. side and the European side. So, all of this is, it's coming to a head right now. And Russia has changed its position. Because if you go back to March of 2022, and Lavrov, made it clear when I met with him along with the judge and Mara in the fall in March, he said, look, that the initial agreement we signed off on, that was brought to the table by the Ukrainians. Yeah, they said the only thing we insisted on was limit the military to 85,000. But we were going to leave Donetsk and Luhansk under Ukrainian control. And then they walked away from it. So the next phase was what Vladimir Putin laid out before the foreign ministry on June 14th of 2024. And it was, okay, we're keeping the 5 provinces, former provinces. They're now part of the Federal Republic, the Russian Federation. NATO has absolutely got to go. You're going to have to reduce your military, and you're going to have elections, because as Putin has reiterated many times this week, what's in there, Zelensky and his group, they're a criminal gang. They have no standing to negotiate. And the same can be applied to Zelensky. Unless there are actual genuine bona fide elections, Russia doesn't have anybody to negotiate with on the Ukrainian side. So that's where the military option comes in. And one last point, the shift in tactics this week with the attack on Russia's Ghost Fleet, the 2 oil tankers in the Black Sea that were in the Turkish economic zone. Then it was followed up today with an attack off the coast of Africa, near a former French colony. Go figure, who might have done that, attacked with drones. And Putin was livid. I mean, when he was being interviewed today, he made a point that, if this happens again, that we got a range of options, he pointed out, to completely shut down the Black Sea, to impose an embargo on Odessa, or to actually go out and start boarding and dealing with ships that are traveling to Ukraine, even if they're French or British or American. So, I mean, he was what he laid out would mark a significant escalation. So he wasn't playing with the Europeans.
Oh, so in a sense, this entire Kabuki theater, as you put it, is continuing, but also on the ground. I mean, this attacking this oil tanker isn't going to alter the war, not at all. Ray, do you think it plays into what's going on the diplomatic side?
Actually, false flag attacks, or attacks such as Larry just mentioned, are par for the course. As Larry also said, they're not going to change anything. It's a measure of how delusional the people in Kiev still are, and how they think they can still be supported by Europeans that don't have any weapons, don't have any money, don't have any real pizzazz to put behind their support. It's a question to me as to how long it will take the Europeans to realize that the game is over. They've been shunted aside, just like Rubio and Kellogg, and just like Zelensky. So there are a lot of things that just came up in the conversation here. One is that Ushakov, who gives the readout for all these things and has for the last 5 years, said yesterday after the meeting that this is being turned over to the foreign ministry now, the foreign ministry be working on this. And so that Larry was good in making the point that the foreign ministry has been sort of marginal, but now, at least according to Ushakov, who should know, the foreign ministry are working like beavers to try to get progress and maybe even a summit if things can be arranged. That's one thing. With respect to Ushakov, I watched them last night, and I was reminded of something really relevant here. It has to do with what Larry said about the Minsk deceptions, where, as Larry said, Hollande and Merkel said, that was just to give the Ukrainians time to get all measured up and weaponed up and trained up by the NATO force. Now look at them now. They're ready, okay? Now, it was about that time in 2021, actually, so a couple months before the invasion of Ukraine, that Ushakov was the main readout person for a very important conversation on the telephone between Putin and Bush, President George, not Bush, Biden, okay, President Biden. So what happens? Well, on the 30th of December, the Kremlin calls the White House and says, Mr. President Putin would like to talk to President Biden right away. And well, wait a second. Our delegations are going to meet in Geneva in less than 2 weeks, and we just talked 2 weeks away. No, please, right away. He'd like to talk to him. Now, Biden, I guess to his credit, says, I'll take the call. But he's home alone.
Yeah.
In a place called Delaware, okay? And he takes the call, and Ushakov, and this is the point here, Ushakov has the readout. And he tells what happened. He says, the President of the United States said that Washington has no intention of putting offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. Whoa. Was that important? You bet yeah, that was important, because just 9 days prior, Putin had told his military in an open session, look, if they get hypersonic missiles and put them in Ukraine, and they will, says Putin, I will have only 5 minutes. Look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes to decide whether to destroy the rest of the world. He didn't say it that way. And so the military ganged up on Putin, I think, and said, look, you better call Biden now. And when we get these negotiations going, at least we can get off on a good start. They don't need offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. They got them in Poland already, or can, and in Romania. So the president said, that sounds like a good idea to me. Ushakov, the president said, we have no intention of putting offensive strike missiles in. Ushakov was euphoric the next day, New Year's Eve, 2021. 21. My God, they're finally listening to it. They're finally recognizing our core interests. This satisfies most of the provisions in that draft treaty we gave them. We're going. And what happens? Well, when the U.S. and the Russian delegation meet in Geneva on the 12th of January, Ryabkov, who's there, who's the deputy foreign minister, he meets with Wendy Sherman, our person, and he says, now let's get down to tax here. That was terrific what Biden promised. Let's flesh it out here. I said, well, what do we talk about? Oh, the promise not to put offensive strike missiles in. You don't know about that? No, the first time I heard about it, says Wendy Sherman. On the 21st of January, so 2 weeks later, Lavrov finally buttonholes Tony Blinken. And I said, Tony, what's going on here, for God's sake? The president says you made this promise. We're all euphoric. And now, and Blinken says, forget about it. Forget about it. He was home alone. I wasn't there. Sullivan wasn't there. Forget about it. We have the right to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, and we will if they ask us. Now, we might talk about maybe how to limit some of them. So, okay, that was the 21st of January. On the 12th of February was the last call between Biden and Putin. And the readout, again, by Ushakov was the president of the United States declined to talk about his earlier undertaking not to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. Now, why do I say all that? Well, Ushakov has had this very painful experience. He knows America as well as anyone, including Lavrov, because Ushakov was ambassador in Washington from 1998 until 2008, which I think is about 10 years, okay? Since then, since 2012, he's been Putin's primary guy on Europe and especially on Ukraine. So all I'm saying here is this is a natural break on what Putin might be tempted to do, because Ushakov's going to say, look, doverai no proverai, trust but verify, okay? If they're going to make a promise, make sure you can verify it. So there's that natural thing, and I thought that would be relevant in terms of talking about Ushakov being very, very careful with his readout yesterday, and at the same time being jocular by saying, well, you know, they promised us that they go right home. Well, let's see what they do. Will they go to Kiev? Well, they promised us they wouldn't go to Kiev. So, you know, it was really a masterful performance on his part. And all I'm saying is that you talk about readouts. Well, Ushakov knows readouts up and down, okay? And that was a very bad experience he had. They're not going to have that kind of experience again as long as Ushakov is still around.
Yeah, that's why I wonder, Larry, like, you know, Vladimir Putin is the one who once said, or is reported to have said, that he met several US presidents, and whenever you meet them in person, you have an understanding, but then they go home and they're visited by the people in the black suits who then explain to them how things happen, and all of the previous agreements that you had in private are basically out of the window. So they know that. The Russians know this. This is not a... I don't think they're blue-eyed about it anymore, especially after Minsk and so on, after knowing how they've been had. So what would you say is the most likely strategy in order for them still to kind of guide a process? I do think they think in processes, the Russians.
Yeah.
And this is a process that they're willing to go along with. And if we read the TASS news agency, they are starting to use that word compromise. No compromise has been reached yet. Right. So this is an interesting word. Can you maybe speak to that?
Yeah, I think what the United States might be looking for, what the Trump administration is, you know, the kind of deal where, so Russia's got these 5 territories. Surely they can live with 3. They just give up those 2. Not going to happen. Okay. I mean, Russia has had 2 goals from the outset: demilitarize Ukraine and denazify Ukraine. Those are really the 2 fundamental goals. They're not going to, those don't disappear. Those have to go forward and be implemented. Now, would Russia prefer to implement it through diplomatic means? Absolutely. It's almost, I mean, 2 years ago, almost to the day, I was in Moscow and met Sergei Rybkov for the first time. And I was there with Pepe Escobar. And we had a very brief conversation with Rybkov, but he emphasized then the frustration on the part of the Russian foreign ministry about the lack of communication. And it wasn't just frustration, it was sort of alarm as well. Like he was pointing out, during the Cold War, we communicated. When the Soviet Union was providing weapons and personnel to fight Americans in Vietnam, we were communicating. We were actually negotiating arms control agreements. And he said, we don't have communication now. Now that has changed. And so the Russians want to keep the lines of communication open and are avoiding taking any steps that will be deliberately insulting. But at the same time, that's why Putin explains to both Witkoff and Kushner, this is what this is what demilitarization, denazification mean, and hoping that will be communicated back to Donald Trump, and if hopefully can disabuse Trump of the notion that this is a easy, quick negotiation that's going to be over in a day or by the first of the year. So the Russians put a high value on that communication. The problem on the U.S. side is, and I think Ray, this was one of his, foundational analytical points when he was running things out at the CIA on the Soviet analysis side, which is listen to what the Russians say. They're not given to BSing and blowing smoke, and particularly when they're all saying the same thing. You better take that on board. It means something. So that's why I say you listen to Ushakov, you listen to Zakharova, you listen to Lavrov, you listen to Rybkov. You just you go down the list, and none of the Russians are saying something different. So you got to say, maybe we should listen to them.
The kings of not listening and queens of not listening is really the Europeans. I mean, it's fantastic to me to think in what kind of delusions they're living in, and they're now fuming, but there's nothing they can do. Ray, do you think that are the Chihuahuas in Europe on a short enough leash for them not to hurt whatever is going on? Because they try. They try very hard. But how do you estimate the leash to Europe by the White House, by the Trump administration?
European leaders are in very dire straits. They're going to lose out. They're going to get removed from office within the next year and a half. So they have a personal stake in keeping this thing going. How are they to tell their electorate, oh, sorry, we gave $60 billion to these guys and they put it in their own banks, and besides we're losing. They can't do that just now. I think reality will have to impose itself on them. But right now, the Europeans are not only a fly in the ointment, but the fly has been swatted away by Trump and even by Witkoff and the others, and by the Russians. Zelensky, he's going to be around for as long as he's useful. Now we have Zelensky, who's no longer delusional in thinking that he might come back in, and he sort of pretty much said that in an article, Daily Telegraph, I think it was just 2 days ago. So all these things need to be sorted out, and it's going to take time, but time is on Russia's side. Mm-hmm. Trump, we analysts, we have to read everything. We have to kind of read even memoirs and stuff, and it's awful, but now we have to watch everything. God, we have to watch the President of the United States hanging onto the bulwark in the plane, and we have to hear the noise, and then we have to answer. And what does he say? He says, well, how long is it going to take? It's up to the Russians. The Russians are doing rather well, mind you, and it's a matter of, if they don't show some flexibility to the Ukrainians, the Russians are going to take that territory anyway. And so it's a choice between losing 50,000 or 60,000 more people in the process, or come to some deal now. Right? So Trump knows that who's winning now. And that's a big deal, because just 2 months ago, he said, Ukraine could win. Okay. So that's the background to this. Now, you mentioned not only the Europeans, but, I fear a false flag attack of more magnitude than we've seen, these drones and all these things. The Europeans are capable of that, particularly the British can do that. So that would be the main thing that could put the kibosh on all this. But also, you mentioned the deep state, and I'm glad you mentioned that little story about Putin himself saying, then the president is visited by the men with the trench coats and these little attaché cases, okay? The deep state. Now, who revealed that intercepted conversation between Dmitriev and Ushakov? My God, it had to be a state agency. My friends in NSA, you reassured me that had to be some sort of government agency, okay? Now, if it was the Saudis, well, they could have done it from a thumbtack. But if you have intercepted conversations between two Russian leaders, my God, that blows that source out. Source probably cost $1 trillion to develop. And so whoever did that in the deep state, trying to cast aspersions on, look at that, it was Dmitriev and Ushakov that was, they prepared the 28 points. So just for that, they're willing to blow the source, to sacrifice all this stuff. So that shows that you're quite right in pointing out the men at the trench coats and the hats and the attaché cases, because as you know, Putin himself has said that. So they're being very cautious. The good news is that so is Trump so far. Now that he's got religion, now that he's got Trump, you've got Kellogg and probably Hexeth on this, and Rubio on the outside. And sure, it's unconventional, but it works. I mean, why would Putin meet 6 times with Witkoff? I mean, all right, it's not proper. It's the British say it's not proper at all, but it works. So I think things are back on track. Larry is right. It's going to take quite a while. But the genesis of this thing was as much the United States as Russia. Russia can wait. You're right, Pascal, in emphasizing that the Russians really want something more, okay? Why did this thing take 5 hours? It's very clear. This is what Ushakov said right after it was over. The meeting lasted 5 hours. Why? Because there was an opportunity to thoroughly discuss the prospects for further joint work to achieve a long-term peaceful settlement of Ukraine. Core interests, new architecture, long-term. That takes 5 hours, okay? So, yeah, we didn't get into the weeds, into details very much, although, interestingly enough, he points out we did discuss territorial matters, okay? I'm surprised at that myself at this early stage. But things are given to the foreign ministry now. Hopefully they'll find somebody on the Washington end that can deal with these things in our State Department, and that's a dubious proposition. But the other thing I'll mention is that Putin, on the 22nd of September, made a major move in saying, look, New START is dead on the 5th of February. We think that it would be really good if we adhered to the quantitative limits of New START, the only strategic treaty that we have left. And so we are willing to put a moratorium on violating those limits if you will do that too. Now, Trump was asked about that 2 weeks later, and he said, well, it sounds like a good idea to me. And that's where it's proper to require something more official. That's what Putin and Lavrov said. Can we have something more official on that? But therein lies the real denouement. Because if Trump says no, on February 6th, the day after, by law, our bombers are going to be fit. All the B-52s, or the smarter ones, will be fitted with nuclear devices, because that's what Congress, an act of Congress, says. And we'll be off into the Wild West dealing with an unconstrained arms control regime. So the Russians are waiting on that. And I dare say this will be the litmus test par excellence. If Trump says no, then he's in bed with the military-industrial complex and the deep state. If he says yes, well, maybe he has enough cojones not only to say yes to that, but to force the kind of deal that Putin would really like to have, rather than take over most of the rest of Ukraine or even have to settle for half of it. He wants a bigger deal. He thinks that Trump understands that now. Certainly Witkoff does. Witkoff is quite a bit smarter than Rubio, which damning with faint praise, I think. But anyhow, Rubio is going to start, Venezuela. You got to do that, Marco. We'll handle Europe and Ukraine. I say, this little by little, I see progress in sight, unless there's some big false flag thing that disrupts it. And I dearly hope that the security forces of Russia and the others can prevent that kind of thing and make sure people know what it is when it happens.
These are very good points, and maybe we end with Larry. Like, do you also see that, in a sense, what the Russians are doing is to drive home the point? Look, Ukraine is a dead horse. Why throw good money after bad money? The Americans are not willing to let it go yet because it still has strategic value, but apparently they understand that too. And at the same time, there's this larger strategic negotiation, apparently, and I think it's very good that you brought that up, Ray, the New START, the nuclear, the last agreements we have. There's also this one point, which is that the US has now the right to station to man 15 military bases in Finland and 17 in Sweden, and except for one, they didn't. So in a sense, there is apparently like also a larger picture going on, right? And is it fair to say that maybe the Moscow and Washington are currently rather about the larger picture than about the details on the battlefield, and the details and territorial concessions is more of a thing for news bites, and it's the larger thing that especially Moscow is after?
Oh yeah, no, definitely the bigger picture. They want security. They've spent 30 years watching the expansion of NATO, watching NATO conducting offensive training for Ukraine, specifically in the area of cyber warfare. Most NATO exercises are described as defensive in nature, but I remember seeing on the US UCOM website, they were teaching offensive, and they used the word offensive cyber warfare. When you step back and realize that Ukraine, the United States, European Command, and NATO have conducted more exercises in Ukraine with Ukraine as a partner than 24 of the other actual NATO members. Think about that. So that means, for all practical effects, for now more than 30 years, since going back to 1995, with that Ukraine's been a de facto member of NATO, and Russia was not in a position militarily or technologically or economically really until 2022 that it could finally stand up and say, okay, this is going to stop. And so in the back of their mind, I'm sure they're seeing, well, they want to have a positive relationship with the West, particularly with the United States. But during my recent visit to Moscow, I got to spend about 3 days with Sergei Karaganov. Karaganov is he's a vocal proponent that Russia's future is not in the West, it's in the East. And we got to expand in the East and in Siberia and with China. And he's a very influential figure. In fact, when I was there, I was supposed to have a meeting with Kirill Dmitriev, but I had committed already to doing something with Karaganov, so I had to tell Dmitriev, well, see you next time.
You can meet the negotiators.
Yeah, but yeah, I think Ray's exactly right. This is Russia wants, they're looking big picture, but they also recognize Europe is a malevolent force, but fortunately, it doesn't have the power that it thinks it does, and they will want to deal with Europe on an equal basis, but the Europeans are refusing to cooperate. They're worse than a pouting teenager.
Ray, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just a little footnote here. I think it was really kind of poetic justice. Lavrov, were he to have participated in these talks, would have had an empty chair across from him, because Rubio wasn't allowed to come. Now, did Lavrov go off and play golf, or did he sit home and listen to music? No. Wang Yi was there, Chinese foreign minister, his opposite number. And he was whining and dining and cavorting cavorting, I guess I'm trying to say, with Wang Yi, who is one imposing diplomat in his own right. So in that microcosm, you see where things are headed. The Russians are really looking toward China. China and Russia are joined at the hip right now. That's that's a tectonic shift in relationships, correlation of forces. 2 against 1, for God's sake. It's going to take a little while longer for the U.S. and the Europeans to realize that they're in the minority. I think just the last thing is that performance on Liberation Day, victory over Japan in Beijing, where representatives of good half of the world were there. No Western people to speak of. No Putin. What's his name? Trump. I have a mental block. Trump. Talking about Trump. He wasn't there. I think that that's part of the reason why I said, "My God, this is awful." You told me we were the all-powerful country in the world. What are we going to do? Now, you may think this a little funny, but I think that in Trump's mind, he said, "My God, we have to do something." Oh, I know what we'll do. We'll focus on our own hemisphere. We'll tell this fellow Eldridge Colby to change from attacking China to our Western Hemisphere and the United States itself, because we need troops to keep the peace. Yeah, I think that was part of his record. And if there's a parallel in the past, which I won't go into, but why did the U.S. choose to invade Grenada? Because they had just lost 241 Marines in Beirut. Okay, so there's this impulse to show how tough you are. Hegseth, of course, is the paradigm of that. We'll see what happens in Venezuela, but I think that's part of it. We have to show that we still matter to somebody, and if we can't do it in our own hemisphere, my God, what good are we? How strong are we? And that's going to play out this week with respect to who ordered that second tap, killing civilians. Well, it's going to be interesting because the congressmen are never going to get the real story, because this was special operations people. It wasn't even the chain of command. These people have their own secrets that they don't share with anybody, sometimes not even with the President of the United States.
What you're pointing out is very valuable. I think this is where we are at. The United States, instead of killing Russians, which they can't do anymore, go off and kill some fishermen in the Caribbean, which is still possible in order to show what they can do. And the Russians, although the Europeans think they're coming head to head with them, it turns out the Russians are now they want to secure the rear and then go forward into the Asian future, which there clearly is. And the question is just how to make sure they don't nip you every once in a while. So I think that's where we are at. This was a very, very fruitful discussion. Ray McGovern and Larry Johnson, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks so much, Pascal.